Our permissive tax exemption, you know, end of 2024 is the end of that bylaw. So in 2025, we will be able to start a new cycle. You could choose to go 1 year at a time. You could choose to go multi-years, but we can prep that bylaw over 2024 or that framework over 2024 so that in 2025 council has, you know, can make some decisions about how they want to do that. The only ones we have to do are for places of worship. Those are statutory from the provincial government. But otherwise, you know, we can take these things like, so the permissive tax exemption, the grant and aid, and your contingency fund, and we can look at a way, you know, through your committee, your policy committee, to formulate it in a way that makes better sense with a dollar amount that council is comfortable with. I think currently it's still in the budget for the 50,000 and I think 25,000 for your contingency. But again, as we discuss budget over this next few days, you will see where we may have to slim some of these things down. We don't want to not support community organizations, but we need them to also not rely on us
100%.
for that money.
Thank you.
Councilor Charney?
Mr. Olden this time. I think it's really important that we do support communities, but I also agree that if we lower the amount, we can spread our money out further to more organizations. And if we look at the ones that really need it within the town, I think that would be much more appropriate than giving large groups like $7,500. I think spreading your money out is much more reasonable.
So for myself, in the past years, when we have started council budget, we do grant and aid in that first. I've never agreed with that. That's something we should be doing at the end of the budget cycle when we know what our rates are going to be and what we've got left over. So I would prefer to see us go that direction this year, that we talk about this at the very end, not at the very beginning, because I just don't think it's viable. And I like the idea of the contingency fund. You brought that in several years ago, and that's where you're bringing something to town where people either stay the night to the event and buy gas, stay in a hotel room, buy food, and within the city boundaries. And and you have to come and say what you're doing and give us the 411 on what you're doing. And then, you know, after the event, you get your money. I think the days of the $7,500 are gone. TNRD, $10,000 for all of TNRD. It's just the way it is. Nobody, you can ask for less than 500 or no more than 1,000. And once it's gone, it's gone. It's just the way it is, because it starts to get a little carried away. I mean, when I first started this in 2008, we had a budget of 50,000, which was 1/4%. That's completely different now. And I think that money, you know, if we're talking about tightening, I think we need to be looking at that. And I agree with Councillor Charney that, you know, these are groups that we need to help, but it's the same groups every single year. And we've become part of their, you know, we have some groups that get contingency sponsorship and a grant and aid. They get hit 3 times. So we can't have that anymore. It's just not feasible any longer. So anyways, that's my 2 cents, but I would prefer to see this process at the end of the budget cycle.
You wouldn't be giving out anything next year?
No. I still say we should, but grant and aid, I think, should become contingency, where we have somebody stand up there and tell us what they're prepared to do and how they're going to do it, and what it's going to be a benefit to the city. We've had some people that have received grant and aid last year that never used it. Well, I don't believe they get it until the work is actually done. So
they do.
Oh, they do. Okay. Well, we were, you know, there's some that have said, yeah, we're going to do this. Never happened. And so
they should have to return.
That's probably, and that's why I like the contingency situation, because now you have to, you come, you talk, you show what you're doing, you have a plan, you have dates, and then we can decide from there. Just the automatic, here's $7,500 see you next year.
And they have to report on it.
Yeah, and there's no reports back. I mean, the report that we got the other night from I think it was the soup kitchen. Was it the soup kitchen we got? That is the first time in all of my council that I've ever seen someone report on what they got for grant and aid. I've never seen it before. And it's something that we ask for. It's right in the application, and it gets glossed over every single time.
Well, we're going to have to rewrite the policy.
Councillor Ogan.
Just want to say that this is a sensitive topic, and we have to be very careful here, because we need to recognize what these organizations are bringing forward. all the events, projects that will have an impact in the community. At the same time, I want to share my experience dealing with granting aids. First of all, a deadline that we are flexible. So we have a deadline, but throughout the year, we can still receive applications. So it makes no sense to me. Secondly, the criteria. When I read the criteria, the policy, if we really stick to the criteria, not every organization can meet that criteria. So what are we doing? Are we doing being flexible to provide that assistance because we know the positive impact it will have in the community, but at the same time, so not everyone is meeting that criteria. Some of them provided financial statements, some others they don't. If you can see from financials, you can see some organizations that they need it, some organizations that they don't. So we have to keep that an eye on that one as well. So impact in the support. So I agree with Mayor in the sense that my question to some of those applications was that in their application they said that there was going to be some efforts to fundraise or to raise the money, but it was later in the year. So if we process the applications once they have already done these efforts, once we already know what they have done to raise this capital, then we know how much they need from the city. And we have to determine how much money is going to be received because they cannot receive the granting aid and think that this is going to be a steady revenue stream for the organizations to be able to deliver that specific project. So we recognize the value of those projects, but we have to make sure that they do their best and they rely on the city once it's needed and in that they meet the criteria.
I understand the frustration that you express about having the grant and aid at the end, but if we already know we're not going to spend any more than a certain amount, some of these people are coming to us in December with items so that they can plan for their whole year. And some of these groups have such low membership that trying to raise funds is difficult. And I do see the point that sometimes we have multiple groups coming year after year. I agree with those statements, but it's just, even if we're putting that in for a draft budget, a lot of the items on here, if we have 197,000, which was a complete total, and 75,000 was the 50 and 25, that's 122. That's already maybe coming up next year for the bylaw review for permissive tax. If we know that we're going to do that, we don't have to spend all of it. That's just an item, and we don't have to do any of that. And we always were supposed to have the reporting. It's just that hasn't been followed through necessarily. Maybe we could make the process a little stricter and stick to the to the guidelines like Councillor O'Geen says. But I think if we push it to the end of budget, which wouldn't maybe get approved till February, you know, that just so that these groups can plan ahead. That's my only thought, that doing it early is convenient, but maybe we just need to change the.
I don't suggest the end of budget. I suggest the end of us talking about budget and getting it to approval stage.
Okay.
In the next 4 or 5 days,
Okay.
not when it's actually passed, because
Okay.
that would make no sense at all. You're right.
Okay.
So I guess
Just
I wasn't clear on that. So
Sorry, that's all I was
Yeah,
wondering.
no,
'Cause
I
I'm
wasn't
thinking,
clear on that.
because
So-
we won't have the rolls
Yeah.
until the end of April.
So we have not put out the call for grant and aid.
no, we have not.
So we're actually not prepared to bring that to you in the next 4 to 5 days because we want to make sure that council has a clear understanding of the budget and what amount should be coming forward. And I think that, you know, Councillor Charney's suggestion as well, that it should be spread out, whatever amount that should be. So my recommendation is that based on the draft budget, and we're going to be like, we can make some approximation on the tax revenue based on last year's roll. So we have a good sense of what our taxation revenue is and how much of a tax increase we are going to need based on last year's roll. So my recommendation would be that if council chooses to change the number or address the number, that we would want to have an opportunity for groups to submit within the next couple of months, maybe, you know, March 1st, and then have that discussion, because ultimately, you know, you really have to make some decisions about where you're slimming. In your, you know, we may, as an operation, have to make some of those decisions, but council also is going to have to make some of those decisions. So, I mean, I think it actually makes better sense to do it in the spring. I know people are planning ahead, but many municipalities do it as a, instead of giving the grant, they actually require receipts.
Mhm.
And I think that's, as Council Ogan was saying, that is how you get them to report accurately and not just assume they can have whatever the maximum amount is. But they actually have to go out and do that fundraising, because if they already have that $1,000, they're not going to bother fundraising that $1,000. Not everybody, but it's, people get tired. Volunteerism is very challenging.
And I do believe on the application form, it has a part that says your fundraising, what have you done and what do you plan on doing? And I also do believe in the form it says if you do not do a year-end report, you will not be considered for the following year. And we need to hold fast to that because it's right there. So.
Looking, I guess, for direction on how you would like us to proceed with these four technically, if you think, permissive tax, grant and aid, your contingency fund, and the business licensing bylaw. Those are your four streams in which you provide support to local organizations. If you would like those to be brought to the policy committee for review in the next few months so that we can start prepping any changes.
That would be my preference, to have them brought to policy. Councillor Charney?
Is it possible to have a detailed description of who gets permissive tax exemption, who's been getting that parcel tax that shouldn't be, and so that, and also I know, perfect, and the grant and aids also? Okay, yeah, because that really makes a difference where we can see it all on one page.
Yeah, and I didn't want to bring it specific organizations into the discussion because I don't think that's necessary. But I think, yeah, we have all that information for you. We can discuss in policy committee.
Councillor Hogan?
No, I just want to mention that it was my understanding that it was agreed that it was going to be reviewed by the council policy.
And I'm concerned that I see Councillor Charney with a calculator at a budget meeting. So the recommendation would be that these four items go to the policy committee. I need some of that. Councillor Petrosi, Councillor Etchart. Any other questions on that? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Excuse me. 3.3, 2024 budget presentation to be introduced by Chief Financial Officer Nakanimi, followed by presentation from the department directors, all one of them. So, Kevin, over to you. It's your show.
Thank you, Your Worship. So ultimately, tonight's the start of a week-long engagement with Council, and what I would really hope is that we treat this almost as a working session, Council and staff, an opportunity for Council to provide direction, identify where further information may be required, etc. So what starts the conversation tonight and will follow over the course of the week is a preliminary outlook for the financial plan for the next 5 years. Final decisions are not required during this week, but ultimately your discussion and strategic direction throughout the course of the week help us prepare those final bylaws before May 15th next year. You'll note throughout the week that recovery operations are not included in any of the conversation, given that they do not impact our source and use of funds for municipal purposes. And as well, we have a preliminary plan for you this week. We will true up some of the items that are in progress this year when we go to present final numbers to you. For example, exit 286, the Boat Street construction, etc. Those projects are all underway, and we'll ultimately see where we land at the end of December, work that's completed, what will roll over to next year. We've also got some things that are outstanding in terms of grants, things like the Housing Accelerator Fund, which would ultimately change our level of expenditures, but they would be perfectly offset with grant funding. So you may see some movement more and more, get an announcement from Housing Accelerator soon. As well, there's some uncertainty regarding the gas tax, so that agreement, my understanding, is not currently signed and renewed starting in 2024, federal government and the provinces. And so essentially for the purposes of this week, we premised based on what we received this year, but there is some uncertainty extent that we receive that money going forward. We of course would hope that that amount is higher in negotiation, but I just want council to understand that I don't yet have any clarity regarding that agreement rule, and it's in our budget. I also want to acknowledge that in prior years, council at this point will have generally received what looks like a bylaw schedule, largely comparing the following year, 2024, versus the current year. And throughout the document, you'll see that we're very much pivoting to try and incorporating a longer term view, full 5 years of the bylaw window and an additional 5 years as appropriate for planning and risk management purposes. And ultimately, that should support strategic decision making regarding funding strategies that need to begin in 2024, knowing what that longer term forecast looks like. So the first night tonight will largely center around 2 priorities. These are the 2 things that have been top of mind for me over the last few months. First one is really around financial sustainability and identifies a path to an operating plan that's balanced, in which some of the revenue streams that we take in, so municipal taxation, the user fees that our CAO spoke about earlier, etc., cover the cost of running our departments and our debt payments. And the second priority focuses on longer term risk management, particularly around core municipal services in terms of water and sewer, and the need to begin building reserves to support that future infrastructure need in the community. So before we begin with 2024, I wanted to just revisit what 2023 looked like and give you a view without recovery operations that have comparability as we move throughout the week. What follows on this slide here is a visual representation of our source and use of funds. On the left-hand side, you'll see that this will match the bylaw that we would have approved this May for 2023, and that would have included all of the recovery operations. So on the left-hand side, our source of funds in terms of all the revenue that we bring in has to perfectly balance the use of those funds, and the financial plan bylaw the balance of 0 at the end. And you can see that we budgeted to bring in 55 million, excluding amortization, and spend 55. For comparability, I've adjusted out the recovery operations in terms of the source of funds and the use of funds so that council has a sense of what the core municipal services look like. And so source of funds without recovery operations is 42 million, and then we budgeted to spend 2. Are there any questions on 2020? Next slide, Linda. You'll see that I've tried to summarize 5 key considerations that I was looking at over the last few months as it relates to preparing the preliminary financial plan. So the first thing that was top of mind is the reserve position, something that council asked about when our auditors were in this summer presenting our 2022 financial statements, and continues to be top of mind. The second consideration is placing those reserves in the context of funding future capital needs in the community, and then particularly the need for water and sewer reserves in preparation for what appears to be a significant water and sewer infrastructure deficit over the next 10 years. Fourth consideration was balancing the operational budget. Again, given the capital that has been prepared for this financial plan, it's really important that we start balancing our operating budget, which we can actually run our daily expenditures separate from those capital needs, and then have a funding strategy in place specifically for capital. And then the fifth thing is sourcing that deficit. As you'll see later on tonight, there is an operating deficit that will require some council direction in terms of how we want to source that this year. That'll come from a balance of municipal taxation increases, service level changes in the community, potentially changes in our level of community investment. So the first item is our current reserve position. So the City of Merritt closed out 2022 an unrestricted surplus and reserve position, 15.9 million. And in the 2023 budget, we budgeted to use 5.3 million of those reserves for capital purposes. Disclosures from 151 municipalities across the province were recently made public about a month ago. And that provides us an opportunity to look and see how we compare on a relative basis. So again, given that municipalities will vary greatly in size, a strategy that can be used is to calculate reserves on a per capita basis as a means of creating comparability across the province. As you can see in your graph, the City of Merritt has about $2,000 in reserves for each resident. This contrasts to the provincial average of $4,400 and results in the City of Merritt being in the bottom quartile. For reference, I've tried to provide some select municipalities in and around the area that might be of interest for comparability, including Hope, Logan Lake, Osoyoos, Beachland, Princeton. And you can see in these municipalities, they average about 4,100 in reserves per resident. So again, there's that 50% delta, City of Merritt, and some of our local municipalities. Reserves are one of three key sources of funds as we think about funding future infrastructure and capital needs. These complement borrowing and potentially receiving grants. While reserves per capita is interesting on a relative basis, it ultimately needs to be framed in relation to future capital profile of a community. So for example, if a community has already renewed their infrastructure and invested significantly in water, sewer, etc., we might expect them to have lower reserves per capita, which may be appropriate. So really what we need to do is position our reserve profile against our future capital and see how that compares in that context. Are there any questions from council on the first section looking at reserves on a relative basis across the province?
Just kind of quickly looking at the numbers, even if they hadn't drawn from the reserve of 5.3 million, we still would have been well below the provincial average.
Correct. So we
are
ended
behind the eight ball.
2022 with 15.9, and we budgeted to use some of that reserves to fund this year's capital, which means that we'll have fallen further behind if other municipalities didn't need to draw on their reserves on that same percentage basis to fund their capital profile this year.
Thank you.
So I'll move on to the next section, and that frames reserves in relation to that future capital profile. So reserves, ability to borrow, and grants combine to establish how much capital and infrastructure the City of Merritt can afford in the future. Debt ceilings are something that are prescribed provincially, and the annual liability servicing costs equate to about 25% of what are eligible municipal revenues. And this results in the City of Merritt being able to service up to 4.6 million in annual debt payments. The estimated cost on unissued debt for Exit 286, water and sewer infrastructure, immediately reduces our borrowing capacity. So even though that capital work is not yet complete for that infrastructure, from the province's perspective, they've already reduced our ability to borrow in the future by the full amount of that liability. And as well, given that we have not established a reserve position for future fire trucks and fire department capital requirements, it's prudent to reserve some of our borrowing capacity to fund some of that capital. So I'll walk you through the graph on the bottom here. And essentially you can see that our existing debt is in the bottom wedge. And that tapers over time, as you'd expect, as some of our longer term debts roll off and any equipment that we financed on a 5-year window roll off as well. Exit 286 is in blue. And again, we have to carry that full reduction of our borrowing capacity cost throughout all years. And then in green, I've tried to estimate what those debt servicing costs would be for principal and interest payments for any of our fire department's requirements. You can see that we use about 2.3 million at the peak of our 4.6 million capacity today. As we go through the course of the week, it'll be important to remember that our borrowing ability in the future is tied to our overall revenue stream. So as we start talking about what portion of our deficit we decide to source from municipal taxation, there is a borrowing benefit that comes with that. With a higher tax base and more eligible revenues, that does create additional borrowing capacity that could be used to fund our capital over the next decade or so.
Kevin, I have a question.
Certainly.
Maybe we can touch on 286. When did that become our project?
So I will say that right now we are on a short-term basis borrowing to fund that. And the partners in that project will have options in terms of either paying that back before it rolls into longer-term debt, or we recover those costs through a parcel tax over time. And so we need to get through the short-term borrowing and the actual capital infrastructure in the contract, and then ultimately the partners will decide how the city is reimbursed for that. It may be done immediately, or it may be done parcel tax recovery over time. So that's something that they would elect, and I'll defer to CEO White.
Oh, here we go.
On that, exactly, the previous council approved the debt borrowing via bylaw for this project and puts us in this situation. So yeah, I mean, we have some local improvement options, but ultimately, until it is completed and we negotiate how the repayment will happen, it is part of our debt.
What is our ownership?
Well, we own all the infrastructure to the site.
The one building?
Hmm?
The one building that's up there?
Well, no, we own it to, like any house, we own it to the lot line.
Okay,
Right.
so my thing is when I was on council, we were going to steer away from having any debt on 286 because it wasn't our deal.
And so previous council created a bylaw and the decision was passed. So at this point, our hands are tied. So we'll have to get to the point where the infrastructure is in the ground and we can then look at how we are going to recoup those costs.
What do we feel the yearly return, or how long would it be before we no longer have any stake in that? Do we have any idea?
So ultimately,
Hate to spring this on you, but
It's a big spring. Thanks,
this
Mr. Mayor.
isn't what I sat on when we said 286. We were going to steer as clear from this as possible.
so right now it's short-term borrowing. So essentially, as we're spending capital for the water and sewer infrastructure that we're bringing out to that area, we are eligible to borrow on a short-term basis to cover the cost of that capital, pay those bills. At the point that we would need to roll over into longer-term debt, through the whole process through the regional districts, etc., there'll be an opportunity for the partners to decide whether to reimburse us at that point or for us to recover it through a parcel tax.
Right.
And the exact specifics of all of that, we would need to refer to the contract, that decision point, what that looks like in terms of parcel tax recovery. But my understanding is that those are the two main options for the partners before things convert into long-term debt for the city.
So 286 has been percolating for 25 years. If we have another 20-year wait, are we on the hook for this thing for the next 20 years?
I mean, ultimately, Mr. Mayor, the idea would be that we would recover costs sooner than that, either through, again, direct payments, or we would stage the parcel tax to be appropriate to recover over an acceptable time period.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Regan?
Okay, so what I was thinking too about our public works employees, are we putting them working on this 286 project? Like, so our city dollars, city wages are going towards that?
So the installation of the underground infrastructure is via contractor. What will happen is once,
My question is, are any of our city employees deployed out there?
not currently, but they will be in regards to any maintenance of infrastructure, at least to the lot line of the owned lands. What will happen, or likely will happen, or be an option, is that the developer will develop on-site infrastructure, underground infrastructure, which would typically be turned over to the municipality. But in that case, they would be paying their user fees and be paying parcel tax as well.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that really answers my question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
so right now, we have no staff out there. That's a
Okay.
purely contractor. But as soon as the project is done for installation, then it becomes our responsibility to maintain.
Okay, so we haven't budgeted for that yet either, have we?
Councilor Charney?
My question today was again, 286, so I talked to the CAO and CO, gave me some very good information on 286, exactly what you've just learned. I was shocked to hear that we are paying for that. But I also want to go past 286 and go to Vandersam's development. What is responsibility of Vandersam for taking any of this debt? How is it going to affect Vandersam's property? What I'm saying is all of this money is going that way, to build the water and sewer up to his development. And does he just walk in and there it is? Or is he going to have parcel tax, etc.?
I would need to review the contract again. I believe that there were some negotiations that happened around that, but I don't have that at my fingers. But again, it would be like if you build a house on a road that already has infrastructure, then you pay your parcel tax and your user fees. Right? Like that parcel tax is the payment for the infrastructure or for your share of the infrastructure for that lot. Yeah. So it'd be similar, bigger numbers, but similar concept.
Any other questions? Kevin, back to you.
On the following slide, you'll see that I've tried to stack source of funds or potential source of funds in relation to a cumulative capital program over the next few years. So I've captured our ability to pull from reserves, current reserve position. Some projects may be eligible from the DCCs that we've collected in the past. I've converted our annual servicing ability in terms of our principal and interest payments into a long-term debt assumption. So we have about 30 million in long-term debt borrowing room. And then I've made a grant assumption based on what we know today in terms of specific grants that we would be targeting, whether it's airport, water infrastructure, etc. And you can see that that source of funds gets us into that 50 to 60 million range. Given that Exit 286 has already reduced our borrowing capacity and our ability to borrow in the future, I have pulled that capital out of this view so that we're comparing apples to apples. So removing any Exit 286 capital infrastructure costs, see on a cumulative basis, we end up at about 140 million after 2031. And so essentially we can fund about 45% of our future capital structure city based on our position today. One of the most important things I think in my role is to manage risk for the city. And when I see a capital profile that looks like this on a cumulative basis in relation to source of funds, I don't necessarily see it as capital. I see it as risk. So you'll see as we move through the course of the week that I would like council to consider and provide some direction on how we can increase our ability to manage through that potential risk. You'll have an opportunity tomorrow night with the Director of Public Works and Engineering to really dig into the details with him on some of that risk in terms of key infrastructure needs in the city and what he's got premised here, given that the majority of this cumulative capital is public works, water, sewer, roads, etc. Ultimately, we have the ability to fund any other capital requirements in the city. So whether we're talking about fire department, recreation, etc., have sufficient borrowing room reserves to manage through that. It's the public works infrastructure that we need to amp up our toolkit, be able to navigate what is uncertain at this point. And I know you've already had conversations with CAO White on asset management and the need to really start on that trajectory next year. And essentially tonight, we're probably getting a preview of what some of that work will be, that longer term view in the city of infrastructure, what those needs could look like. We've tried to capture that on a prelim basis, and ultimately we'll continue that work in refining some of those timing, dollars, etc., projects required as we move through the course of next year. Any questions on reserves and our ability to fund future capital infrastructure? So ultimately, next section here, section 3, looks at what a strategic option could be for us to be able to navigate that uncertainty. And so we'll spend some time here looking at the general parcel tax and how that could potentially be funneled directly into water and sewer reserves, and what that amount might look like on an annual basis to be able to build a stronger reserve position on that infrastructure. So parcel taxes are currently imposed based on a single amount or unit of property, except for any areas that are dedicated service. And so that's $200 for sewer and $160 for water. Those current rates generate about 1.1 million in general parcel tax revenue, the water and sewer funds. As discussed earlier, if the user fees in water and sewer are increased such that water and sewer is able to balance on an operating basis and our revenues that we take in from user fees cover the cost of those services in the community, then the parcel tax can be used to build our reserve position over time in funding the approximately 54 million in water and sewer infrastructure that we have in the preliminary plan. As a reminder for Council, the December 31st, 2022 balances for the sewer and water non-statutory reserves were in the table below. So for sewer, we had about $500,000 in reserves, and for water, we do not currently have a reserve fund established on the balance sheet. So our starting position, about $500,000, and that contrasts to capital profile over the next 8 years of 54 million water and sewer infrastructure. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going through tomorrow's night's discussion with our Director of Public Works, really understanding that capital profile.
CEO what?
I just want to interject here. I think it's really important when we think about parcel tax, it's not the fee to use it's not the fee, which I think is how it's been applied in the past, as it was used to offset operational costs. Parcel tax is the cost that you pay to make sure that the pipes that come to your lot line are functional and that the system is functional. To date, it has been used to offset the user fees rather than ensuring that we have infrastructure that meets the demands and the capacity of, or the needs of the city. So it's really important to think about parcel tax was meant to be how we generated funds for renewal and replacement of infrastructure. And for some reason, it has become an operating cost or an operating revenue. So that's not what it would have been intended for.
Yeah, so just, I remember last year at this time when we were discussing this, we were told we had ample amounts in both of these funds. More than any other fund we had, whether it was water and sewer, we were loaded. And apparently somebody had some bad info on that one because we were told that several times. So I'm wondering what happened to the loaded part. So anyway, not the message we got last year. Then again, we didn't have a CFO last year. So see the problems you bring us? Yeah, no, I'm just joking. It's just, we were told several times that these two funds were our healthiest funds.
So even if council wanted to consider our total reserve position, 15.9 or 16 million, that total reserve position is still in relation to 54 million capital infrastructure next 8 years. So even though we haven't maybe siphoned off any of that unrestricted surplus into those funds for water and sewer, even if you took everything that we have sitting in the surplus, it's still in relation to an overall 54 million capital requirement. So I believe that the 54 is over the next, well, I said decade. I think Director of Public Works went out 8 years for us to have a sense of the portion that'll be in the 5-year bylaw window, but the longer term view for planning and risk management.
And we're looking at a minimum of a $30 million retrofit to that plant. So that's probably, I mean, we could go that whole 10 years, but you don't, you know, most of our infrastructure need is in that 8-year window.
Is that just to bring it up to speed, or is that to increase?
This is just renewal of current infrastructure capacity.
The next section here, what I've tried to outline for council is probably extreme bookend scenario, such that you can get a sense of the magnitude that would be required if you wanted to try and self-fund a majority of that capital. Ultimately, you're through with the Director of Public Works Engineering Services in discussing some of those requirements. We can come back to a very simple model that I've built, goal seek, what new numbers would be, what new assumptions I want to offer, what level we would want to try and save for that capital. That being said, as noted, over 2024 to 2031, in the first column of the table here, you can see the 54 million capital. I have made some grant assumptions, and again, have that conversation with council in terms of the level that we want to premise in terms of grants. I've made an assumption for illustrative purposes of 10 million. I've listed DCCs here, and assuming that some of that DCC money would be eligible for these projects, and that ultimately leaves about 39 million that would be required from reserves if we do not want to try and borrow any of that capital. Assuming an interest rate for reserves at 5%, we would need to increase the water parcel tax by $75 every single year. So that's always in relation to the previous year. And the sewer would need to increase by $137 every year over the previous year's amount. And so if we're starting at $200 and $160 currently, you can get a sense of how big those numbers get as we move through the next decade in terms of what the parcel tax rate would be if we wanted to self-fund all of it. And I'm not saying that this is where we'll land, but it gives you a sense of what would be required if we wanted to try and build 39 million in reserves, given our starting position of $500,000 in the sewer fund. So when you have a chance to discuss all of this capital with the Director of Public Works tomorrow night, at the very end, I'll come back and council can provide some additional assumptions, try and work through direction on the level that we want to try and save for, and then ultimately bring some of those parcel tax bylaws to council for consideration.
Councilor Charney?
What do we pay on a parcel tax in water right now?
So we are paying $200 for sewer and $160 for water in terms of the
Oh,
general
great.
parcel tax rates. So that's not
200.
any specific area agreements that we might be recovering funds
So
for parcel tax.
you said water 160. You know, I did read that, and yeah, it's gone. So that means 160 right now, and by 2031, we will be paying $760. And then for the sewer, we would be paying $1,296.
So again, what I'm trying to anchor council on is what the extreme would be. Chose to try and self-fund, build reserves to fund that whole amount of capital. So that's an extreme scenario in which we try and self-fund the majority of those costs.
Well, I
But
think
that's what
it's
would be required to build 39 million in reserves, given our starting position today.
Well, I have no problems with building reserves and anticipating the worst. I think, though, that if we go in this direction, it has to be very clear to the public, we're going from here to here in this short period of time, because that is quite an increase. And I can see if we really need it, we need it. But we have to be very transparent and clear with the residents. This is the direction we are going and why we are going in that direction. It's not just because we're greedy and we want to buy frivolous things. It's because we need the money. Because we're not talking, just a small increase. Over the 7 years there, that's a significant increase in dollars.
I certainly understand that. So I've built some Excel models for the end of the session in which council can provide new assumptions. We might choose to leave a certain level of risk unfunded. So that's a direction that council can provide. We might say that 10 million for grant assumptions is low. It should be X, 15 or 20. And then solve for these two sets of numbers based on those new assumptions. And so I've tried to build that interactive component into tomorrow night, but I want council to have a chance to discuss the actual capital with the Director of Public Works before we do that.
Presenting us is really a snapshot of how far behind we are and what it costs to catch us up. It's not necessarily what we're going to be asking for people to be paying, but if we had to, this is our worst case scenario.
I agree with that. What our financial situation is, because if we don't make it clear to them, we're going to have a rebellion. And so I think that we have to explain where we are and where we're going.
Yeah, I definitely think that it'd be an important time for council to consider having some open houses to talk about what this budget looks like before the final bylaw is passed, right? Because we can't necessarily assume people are watching. Our one person is now gone. So we can't assume that people are watching this, even though we have put it out there, and we can't assume that everybody's going to show up at the open house. And, so multi-pronged communication about what is a challenging time, right? And, jokingly, but not really, like we don't want to be a Soyuz in 5 years, right? We don't want to be going for a 30+% tax increase.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, I think we're paying 360 rate, or 360 now, plus the garbage, right? And so if you're going up 137 for sewer and 75 in water, and that's for a whole year, that's only half of that, which is 106 per biannually. That's not that bad.
337 and 235.
Yeah, plus garbage.
It's the cumulative,
Yeah.
like I think
I know, but the other thing I was going to say is that I think the negative part is that you're not going to get people wanting to move here with taxes like this, or even utility bills like this, And I mean, that's just my point of view. And then some of these people, like, they're barely making their bills right now.
So that's why this is where the fund balancing game comes with council, is how do we do this
Yeah.
and do it where it is available for people that are on fixed incomes, that are seniors. I mean, like the CFO said, this is the worst case scenario.
Yes. And I understand.
And I mean,
that.
we can't expect to build this all back up in 2 years. It's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And we have to be realistic on what those numbers are going to look like. And
Works next tomorrow, you're going to have the opportunity to help us prioritize those that 154 million. Is that 150? No, 100.
Excluding exit 286, it was.
Yeah, 140. You know, like maybe paving isn't as big you know, paving new roads isn't as big a deal. We have ways that we can do things, especially as we move through our asset management work, that where we can make some more strategic decisions. But council may say, well, you know, knowing that we need to do, you know, capital project A, we're going to deprioritize capital project F to outside this window, or, you know, make it, let's risk manage it for another 5 years, or risk manage, you know, anything that's not statutory, like fire trucks, we can risk manage to a certain extent before it becomes not manageable anymore. So yeah, we need to find, council needs to find that balance between being able to build our reserves and manage our risk and alleviate our risk, and still be a place where people want to live, right? Like, not only might we not attract people, we might actually lose people if we're too high. But we have to, it's going to be a super fine balancing act. And unfortunately, that's your job.
well, also too, I mean, this is where we need to get realistic. I mean, we're talking $129,000 in giveaway money every year, and then we're going to raise the taxes. Like, this is where we need to become realistic on what we're giving away and what we're not giving away. And I mean, if we're going to tighten our belts, we got to tighten our belts all across the board. And that means our grant and aids, because it's a big draw. It's almost 2% before we even start. So yeah, you know, we got to become realistic on this kind of thing. Councillor Egan.
Wondering if we could ask the Public Works Director to bring his projects for next year? Everything? Okay.
Councillor Richard.
I think this just goes to show that even though these numbers are high, we're really going to have to take a hard look at all the fees and the user fees and DCCs, and why the bylaw review is necessary, because by being so far behind, it's really put us in this deficit, and having only the 2,000 per capita in reserve, far less than our neighboring communities like Princeton and Logan Lake. So it's really a problem, and maybe things will turn around if we see more development. If 286 goes through, and then the property above Hamilton Hill develops, and they pay in through parcel tax, that will also help. But we still have to think about the next few years and balancing our spending the next 5-year bylaw financial plan as well. So anyway, we have a lot to think about.
Councillor Hogan.
So I just want to mention that Councillor Charney's concern is about education. So we have to communicate with the people why we are doing this, why it's the rationale. So my only concern here is that, as Mayor said, when we dealt with the budget last year, I raised the question why those fees have not been increased for sewer and water, and it was told that there was no need because of the resources that we had in that specific area. So when we make decisions like this, we are relying on the staff information provided to council. Right now the information is different, so now we have to adjust to the new information that is being provided. So I understand that this is the worst case scenario. I do. So I would not recommend to go with that, and that's why we will have to check to see what is realistic, and we have to determine what is going to be what it was mentioned before, is that what we are charging right now is not really covering the operational expenses. That's a big concern. It's a no in any business, right? So now that we are talking about that, we have to see what is that realistic amount that is going to be able at least to cover those expenses, but also to plan ahead so that we will be in a specific number of years having that surplus that we need where we want to be.
And I think that you'll find tomorrow when the CFO goes through that model with you in regards to parcel tax in particular, as well as gives you some assumptions or some options around by the end of the week around our general taxation recommendations, you will see where your choices are and how that impacts the longer, not the unseeable future, but the next 10 to 20 years about that revenue generation and that investment generation, right? And I think it's really important that community members understand the difference between our operating budget and our reserve, right? Municipalities don't want to make money. We need to, especially when in regards to water and sewer, we don't make money on water and sewer. That's like a human rights violation, basically, right? We can't charge more than we need to. So what we do is, if we're looking at what we charge for water and sewer, and that includes the user fees and the parcel tax, we have to cover our operating costs and cover our replacement or renewal or expansion of infrastructure. So when we talk about, new development going to come online possibly, and they'll contribute, but all of that new development also costs us money, right? Every time we put a piece of pipe in the ground, we have to plan now for replacement of that pipe. And we have to plan for replacement of the substrate under the roadway and the paving, sidewalks, streetlights, right? So yes, when we have more development, yes, there's more people contributing to the taxation rate or to the user fees. However, we now have more infrastructure.
And this is why we fight for the permits to be signed, and then we fight for the hospital, because those are strikes against us for people moving to this community. And we can't afford to lose Aspen planers at any point in time, and that's why we continue to fight to get those permits signed. And that's why we fight to keep the hospital open, because, people are leery. One of the first questions you get asked is, what can my kids do and what's wrong with your hospital? It's the first questions I always get asked. So, it's a big deal. Budget is never an easy situation, never is. And, but I think if, as we, Councillor Ogan and Councillor Charney say, if we state our position as it needs to be, it's the same as me going to a contractor and saying, I'd like you to build me a house, but I'd like you to charge me in 1975 prices. It's not going to happen. So, we've got to move ahead and sell this correctly and see a good balancing situation. In the old days when we did the budget, we had a spreadsheet, and as we moved, that spreadsheet went up and down, and we saw the percentages go up and down. And I'd like to kind of hope we get into something like that so we can see the changes as we move along.
So I think what we are presenting to you is a priorities-based budget versus a line-by-line budget or a program budget, right? So ultimately, what we want to be able to hear from you at the end is, I'm preempting the CFO's speech here a little bit, but we're going to want to say, okay, how much do you want us to take out of reserves? How much do you expect for taxation? How much do you want us to slim the budget? The CFO and I will then go back and look at the places where we can slim the budget and present that changes to you. But ultimately, going line by line through the budget is not the strategic level, especially right now, that you guys need to be at. Because right now, it's such a big issue that going through, how much do we spend on toilet paper? How much do we spend? That's the nuances we can deal with. But ultimately, you guys are making some very, very big strategic decisions that are going to impact this community for the next 20 to 30 years.
Okay. Can we okay to take a break for 5 minutes? Stretch our legs here? Okay, let's take 5 minutes here. Yeah.
Just before we pivot to next section, I'd like to return to the graph on page for a minute, Linda. And I just want to do a quick exercise for council just to try and anchor how previous communications might compare to tonight's conversation. So if council could take a piece of paper and just cover anything after 2024 in that graph. And you can see that the source of funds that we have available to us would then be higher than the 1 year of capital. Typically, we've only captured 1 year of capital in our bylaw, plus or minus you about from the chief in terms of the next fire truck. So for last year's financial plan, we included capital for 3, and then we did include the next fire truck spread across 24 and 25. It's when you take that piece of paper away and you start looking at longer term view that that answer then changes. And so I just want council to try and understand how sufficiency in terms of our ability to fund capital changes when you look at 1 year versus 8 or 10 years. And that's just something to keep in mind as we go through this week. I am asking council to have a longer term perspective so that we make decisions next year to a longer term capital profile. So I recognize that that answer may shift as well. Okay, so to page 45, start section 4, the path to balancing the operational budget. So given the current reserve positions that we've seen tonight, the unfunded future capital, and the need or the proposal consideration to have the parcel tax allocated reserves, it's going to be really important to balance our operational budget such that the existing position that we have for reserves, even though it may be smaller, can be pointed exclusively towards supporting our future capital program. In the 2023 budget, parcel taxes were available for water and sewer funds as revenue, and the general fund did require a withdrawal from reserves, 0.8 million from the surplus. And as we'll see here in a few minutes, the 2024 budget is also not currently balanced, and we'll need council's direction on the level of taxation increases, service level changes, etc., that bring that into balance. Prior to council walking through budgets with each director, I'm going to go through a consolidated operational budget and capital budget, see that total picture. On the operational side, you'll see that I've tried to give two views of 2024 costs. One that's anchored on 2023, some of the cost pressures that the city is facing, and then one that has a stack of all of the services and departments such that we can identify where further information might be required, where council might be interested in service level changes. For example, if we talk about waste collection 1 week versus every 2 weeks, things like that. So you can see an overall cost, and we can have conversations with directors where council might be interested in making some service level changes that help narrow that deficit. I'll spend a few minutes walking through the graph on page 46. I thought it might be helpful for council to anchor on 2023, given that that's a budget that you've already seen and approved, and then show how 2024 looks in relation to 2023. So on the very far left here, 2023 revenue budget, 20.5 million. I have included the service level fees changing as review with CAO White, bring in an additional 800,000 city revenue towards covering our costs. For the purposes of the budget and this graph, I have essentially for 286 assumed parcel tax revenue equaling the full cost of debt on an interim basis. The timing of which still needs to be worked, but I wouldn't want us making any operational decisions in relation to that debt. So I've made the assumption that parcel tax revenue next year would cover any costs for 286 debt. And then in the other bucket, we've got some things like grants, return on investment, and development services fees. You'll see in red that I have removed the parcel tax from an operational view, given the proposal that's in front of council to have that allocated to reserves. So I've removed that number from our revenue. And that leaves us with 2024 revenue or any taxation increases of 21. On the cost side, first column for 2024 takes an adjusted view of the 2023 budget, adjusted for operational scope, stacks some of the cost pressures that we're seeing in the city. Things like inflation, 600,000, wages, 400,000, cost of debt, 700,000, majority of which is related to Exit 286. Levy requests of $1 million that you'll review with each of the directors. And then I've separated out the non-levy requests. So as you go through your conversations with each director, I have tried to flag where we already have grant funding and things like that sourced, such that you know that it's not coming out of taxation levy. In the far right column of 2024 costs, I've stacked all of the departments and services in the city such that we can have conversations about where council's interested in further information, making service level changes, etc. So I hope that council refers back to this graph as we go through the course of the week and helps to try and source that 2 million deficit as it stands today between our preliminary revenue next year and our preliminary cost profile. Some combination of taxation increases and service level changes, potentially changes to the level of community investment, would source that 2 million. Any questions on this graph? I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about inflationary pressures in the city. See that that's one of the key cost drivers versus last year's budget. Over half of the inflationary pressures in the plan are from services like the RCMP, 10%, and transit, which is up 12%. And these, while funded by city and taxpayer dollars, are not directly managed by city staff. And any changes to those levels of service would require us to participate in processes external to the city. So for example, in terms of RCMP, really what we control is the level of officers that are assigned to our municipality. So currently we're at 17. So we would have to participate with the RCMP, appropriate notifications to ministries, etc., if we wanted to make any changes to that service. So those aren't things that can be done necessarily quickly, but would have to be directed by council and then worked by staff, and we would need to find timing with external organizations. So just keep that in mind in terms of inflationary pressures that are putting pressure on the taxation increase. 400,000 across RCMP transit is equivalent to 4% of our revenues, just in those two cost pressures year over year. And city staff can't necessarily make any changes in time for January for those items. They would need to be progressed based on the timing of those external organizations and etc. So I just want to make sure council's aware of that cost pressure in the plan from external services that are provided to the
Councilor,
I just have a question on their employee wages for the RCMP and for transit. I mean, how much notice are we given for when they have their wage increase? Or is that done in their contract that we signed for X number of years to pay them an extra dollars?
So the RCMP will communicate a preliminary budget. This happens, I believe, in that June timeframe. Really what the municipality controls is the level of officers. So that's the only mechanism that we have to get that budget. The costs that are associated with the level of officers then actuals, but budget would then be based on that level at a prescribed rate that would be across all of their operations. And so in the June timeframe, we get a view of what those costs would be per officer, essentially. And what we get to control is the level of officers that have supporting.
See you, wait. Oh, Ben? Sure, sure. Councillor Charney.
To go back to this graph, CAO says 1.4 there. What does that entail?
So we'll certainly.
I was just wondering if I'm in the wrong job.
No. So there are some things that don't have a home in other directors' portfolios. So they ultimately live in the CAO's budget. So it's not that that's a salary or even 2 people's salary or 10 people's salary. It's $400,000 for the gas tax that we get goes reserves initially and draw down on that reserve over time to fund our capital. So the transfer of the gas tax into reserves is something that lives in the CAO's budget. Again, I know that inflates this number, but there's things like that. There's other things like grants that we haven't yet repurposed. And so at a CAO level, she's negotiating with the province in terms of past money that's been received. How can we purpose some of that for future projects? So there was some monies that got assigned to projects that were not completed for various reasons. Things like the TOCO or clay banks, etc. So that money now lives in the CAO's budget to negotiate with the province how that money can be repurposed on new projects. And so that's why it's assigned to her, because we haven't yet agreed with provincial funding sources on what those new projects will be. And so I've assigned them CAO the interim.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that. And again on this graph, parks are 0.5. One of the things that the residents they see, they use, it's a constant, are our parks, and it's so low priority on here. You know, I would hope that in the next couple of days we can discuss how we can take from Peter to pay Paul, you know, to get more money into our parks, because they're the number one things that residents use. And I think it's valuable that we have parks that are up and running, looked after, and that people can use. That's my personal opinion.
See you, wait.
I obviously agree with you about the importance of parks. It would be crazy for me not to. And I'm, you know, a recreation person. I think what you're seeing though is that actually is a good amount of money, but the cost of things like public works is so high because that is our critical infrastructure, right? Like no water, no sewer, no town. Technically we can have a town without parks. We don't want to, but the difference is that those critical things like public works, like the RCMP, are always going to be higher level amounts. So, you know, it looks in comparison very small, but when you're talking about, you know, $500,000 or $5 million, sorry, $50 million worth of infrastructure in the ground, for instance, you know, that's a lot of, we're talking about maintenance, we're talking about equipment, we're talking about, so it's not just staff or anything, like that's all of the equipment, gas, power. So there's a lot. It looks small, but in comparison to those other things, that's why it looks small. It's not that it's actually a small amount.
And
So
it's not,
one thing we have to also be aware of the fact that with some of the changes that have come through provincial government that I've made comments about and council's made comments about, we have a lot of downloading going to our CMP and our fire department that have to kick in when our medical doesn't work anymore or the 2.5 decrim. It's downloading, and also to the RCMP no longer looking after highway accidents. It's now in the community with absolutely no process to us at all. And the minute it happens on the coast, everybody gets all upset and they pull it back. Oh, we'll review it come spring. So, you know, we have these costs that are tagged on top of us. And that's why we constantly veller about it, is because you can't expect our budgets for the RCMP and the fire to now go to downloading on something you don't want to do. So that's why we make the comments we do and we ask the questions that we do, because we have to get some of this money back, because that's our tax dollars going for provincial downloading. I've said my 2 cents, I won't say. And you were going to say? Okay.
Councillor Charney, that is just the operating costs as well. So on page 56, there is the capital operation shows where projects are being targeted for investment. Okay, okay. We'll get to that tomorrow night. Any other questions on that graph? So our fifth and final section for tonight then is talking about that $2 million deficit that you saw that has to be sourced either a combination of tax levy increases, service level changes, changes in community investment. So the city of Merritt budgeted to bring in 10.3 million property tax revenue last year or this year for 2023. And the 2024 operational deficit requires sourcing 2 million. There's approximately 6 million in operational costs that council and staff have either no influence in terms of debt that's already been undertaken by the municipality, or where we have to work through external agencies to make any changes. So that leaves us with about 17.4 million costs that we actually have some influence of varying degree of change. And you can have conversations with each director on what that might be for their areas. So for example, for finance, it's mostly wage costs, we have to pay for audit fees, and we have our tax sale charges. So given that there's very limited ability to influence our audit fees and provincial requirements for the tax sale, any changes to finance, as an example, would need to be made on the people. So there's going to be areas that are very people focused. You have to be aware that service level changes are impacting people. And then there's other areas where there's bigger operational costs that aren't. So we can have that conversation, each team, on what that might be for their area. On the following page on 48, I've tried to provide an illustrative example of how we might source that operational deficit. This example is sourced with consecutive 12.5% taxation increases, 12.5% next year, 12.5% in 2025. It would also involve service cuts of 4% of non-wage costs, or 2% of operational costs if you did wages. And it would also include using reserves in 2024 to smooth the transition to a balanced operating budget for 2 years. So I understand that doing all of that balancing in 1 year would be challenging for the community, challenging for council to provide direction. So there is potential paths where we do use the surplus for next year to smooth that transition, but ultimately for sustainability long term, be thinking about reserves targeted at our capital program, not for our operating. 2025 also includes potential changes in level of community investment from council. So as you saw, that number is close to 100,000 this year. If we were to make some changes, that could be a contributing factor towards sourcing deficits longer term. So again, this is an illustrative example. Ultimately, as we progress through the week, your direction will help us understand where we think that deficit can be sourced. As mentioned earlier, to the level that we source the deficit through taxation increases, that does create additional borrowing capacity for the municipality. So if we were to increase revenues by 3 million, that would increase our eligible revenues from a borrowing perspective and would create about 10 million in borrowing capacity that could then be used to fund capital programs, emergency bases, etc. So that's just something to be aware of in terms of how we decide to source that deficit. In the table below, I've tried to give a little bit of a sensitivity matrix in terms of potential paths at which deficit could be sourced. So in the first line, overall increases in municipal taxes of 20% would mean that our new municipal revenues next year would be 12.3 million, and we would not make any service level changes in programs or use reserves to balance the budget. In the illustrative example that I've provided, 12.5% next year and the year after would mean that we increase municipal taxes next year by 1.3 million, leaving us with 11.5 million taxation revenue and the need to find about 700,000, some combination of service level changes and using reserves. So as we progress through the week, I'm certainly keen to understand from council's perspective where we want to try and prioritize sourcing that 2 million deficit across these areas. Questions on that section?
The chart at the bottom of page 48, service reductions. Do you have examples of what you envision service reductions? For example, the pool closed 1 day a week. What is
Certainly.
suggested for service reductions?
So an example might be waste collection every 2 weeks, as done in other municipalities versus 1 week. We've got cost pressures with the TNRD tipping fees, so we're already fighting that cost pressure battle. That's something that council could undertake, direct the Director of Public Works to explore and report back to council on what would that mean in terms of operational savings if we were to go every 2 weeks instead of every week for waste collection. That would be an example. For an area such as finance, where it's very much people wages and little ability to control any other costs, you might find an overall percentage reduction, which I would then either have to decide, is that a reduction amount of finance support? Is that leaving a position vacant for a period of time if it becomes available to try and source savings? So for example, instead of posting a vacant position on January 1st, I might need to post it as of March 1st if I needed to find operational savings finance if I wanted to meet the current level of finance support that we have. But those would be the things that strategic direction in terms of the operational changes would come from council, potentially level of reduction, and then CEO White and myself, the director team, then need to find out how to translate that into savings. And it might really vary widely based on area. So it could be something that impacts the community like waste collection, or it could be something that needs to be done during City Hall to find that savings, such as leaving a position vacant. So those would be a couple examples of very different scenarios on how we might need to source operational savings. Some will impact the community more than others. Some will impact City Hall staff support. So that's the type of examples I'm thinking about.
Will we as council have any input or suggestions also, or is it strictly staff?
So what I would suggest is that we don't have any priced out changes. So if you said, what is palatable to the community? Is closing the pool 1 day a week palatable to the community? How much is that going to save us? We would go back and find those dollars.
Okay.
If going to twice weekly garbage collection is palatable to the city, then we would go back and look at those cost savings and be able to now bring you some options. But ultimately what we're looking for from council is to give us some sense of where you think is most appropriate for us to be looking for those cost savings. And then we will try and translate that. So if you told us, okay, we just want to see, a 5% reduction in all costs. Well, that's a very different kind of, that gives us a really broad, but we can look at that. But ultimately the best way to do it is to say this level of service, we cannot sustain this level of service, or we must sustain this level of service, or, we must increase. That's where we need to have that direction from you, so we know where to go back and look for those cost savings. So we're not presuming anywhere we think is specific, or bringing you any concrete suggestions now, because ultimately that is for you as the elected officials to have a pulse of the community and be able to give us some of those directions.
Thank you.
Make sure that I got this right. So we have a deficit of 2 million. We have some options here. So we have an option is 20% and to maintain the same services that we are currently providing. Or we can go with 12.5% and we will have to, that will have an impact of 700,000 that we have to reduce services.
Correct. So these are 4 examples, just to give
Yes. To give you a sense.
ranges. Ultimately, council could direct a taxation increase of 13.72 overall, and then we would translate what that impact would be on they're finding operational savings or drawing from reserves. These are just possible paths.
And I appreciate that. I mean, that gives me a clear picture. So regarding the service reduction, if we feel that 200,000 is the way that we want to go, then staff will look into what type of services will be reduced to come up with the $200,000.
Yeah, we could. I mean, if you want, said, okay, we're going to go with a 2.5% tax increase, but we don't want to change our service levels. Well, that 700,000 now has to come out of reserve rather than service changes, right? So that we have that balancing of how much are we going to take out of reserve versus how much are we going to change services or not. Because we could say, I mean, I think what the CFO has presented is that, 400,000 out of reserve, because it's going to be challenging to slim the budget and change levels of service without having some negative feedback from the community. However, if we take a whole $700,000 out of the reserve, that doesn't put us in a better position. So it's some combination that council's going to be comfortable with, and that's where we'll go. So if you say, okay, well, we're going to take 500,000 out of reserve, this is the last time we're doing it, find us $200,000, then we're going to, we'll give, and we want them to be in these areas, service cuts in these areas. So maybe we don't plow snow unless it's more than 6 inches on the ground, right? I don't know. Sorry, Councilor Carney.
I was just wondering with any of these calculations, right now we have some of the reserve for the recovery that did make good interest last year. Is it possible that for this year, if we do the increase of the 12.5 and have the 700,000, that some of that interest would help offset some of this cost, or has that already been factored in?
Certainly. So I have not adjusted any reserve balances for investment return. It's sure that's something. And we need to allocate investment returns across general funds, reserve funds, and potentially some of the recovery funding that we've received in advance. And so that conversation is progressing. So I haven't updated their balances yet. It's certainly possible that investment return would increase reserve balances, including in the financial stabilization reserve, which is one that is available that we could consider drawing on to smooth out the impact. And so that would be an area that we could target, and it would have some investment return allocated when that process.
I mean, it's clear that we're going to have an increase, but I was just thinking even sometimes, at least in the last 2 years, the investment income increases helped us have less of a negative impact, but we have to be more aggressive with these reserves. I know, but at least this kind of gives us a good plan and good scenario. So thank you for that.
I have factored in higher investment returns in the graph that you saw on page 6. So there is $200,000 in higher revenue that's already sourcing some of that. So you could picture that deficit as 2.2 million, that investment return then sourcing 200,000 of that deficit. And so given current interest rates and our balances, I have adjusted budget for investment return. So that is already contributing towards sourcing some of that deficit.
And I think it's really important when we think about, we're paying interest on our debt, we need to maintain the interest we're dealing with in our investments, right? Because if we're not we're already, like as you said, paying Peter to, stealing from Peter to pay Paul kind of situation, right? We want to make sure that we're not using that interest as part of our operations.
No.
So, and as the CFO said, really, we have to make this the last year that this happens. We really do, or we're going to continue to be in a very ugly situation.
Councilor Charlie?
I really don't think that we should be touching our reserves. I think these should be built up. So I think we really have to look at this 700,000 and more of where we can tighten our belts efficiently without impacting the community with the least impact possible. So I think it's going to be, you have to use your imagination. We might have to get brutal, but I don't think touching reserves is an option in my mind. I see adding to reserves, not taking from reserves anymore. So I think we have to have tighten our belts and look to where we can do it with the least impact.
Councilor Egan?
I would tend to agree with Councillor Charney, and I would also prefer not to touch our interest income. Well, it sounds good. You can take the interest to take off the heat and some of the deficit, but I think you're losing opportunity at increased income. That's my opinion.
So one of the things that I've talked to the CAO about is possibly start looking at sponsorships, such as someone sponsors the arena. We go through the pool. I notice most of the sponsorship debenture tiles in there are from companies that no longer even exist in this valley. Time to pull them down and see if we can get a different set of debentures and a different set of investments in there. There's possibly some situations of selling things that are burdening us. And moving on with that sort of thing. I think that's what we need to look at. And, what we still pay out for someone to manage, maybe we have it city owned and that's the way it is. Claybanks Park has always had a manager. Maybe we start bringing that back into our purview and have it run just like we did the arena and the airport and cut the middleman out there. So I think there's a lot of things we can do, but I think sponsorships is one that we need to start looking at and seeing what we can get. Have someone put their name on some of our buildings. I think we're kind of behind the times in that. Most communities have that already. And so I think it's time for us to start looking at that.
I agree. I think that, there's all the utilities, there's Highland Valley Copper, a lot of other large businesses around that may be coming to the area or who may already be here that might be interested.
No,
Actually, that is actually on the Economic Development Officer's action board. So,
excellent. Just a quick question, maybe one of the two of you can help me now. I did go down to Kelowna this year and I pulled a grant, they gave us $3.5 million for water meters. Does that factor into anything we have, or is that when we decide to move forward, we get the 3.5? How does this work? I'm just curious.
I believe that's a return on investment in grants. I think we have to do some work before we get the final amounts for that grant. And we're just working right now through the project charter.
Okay.
The Director of Public Works is working on prepping that to go out to RFP for installation. It's a multi-year project.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I guess the question that I'm asking is if we are able to have that money and it does sit as long as, next for multi-years, are we able to pull any kind of interest off of that 3.5 sitting in the bank? I'm curious.
What we're finding is that the province, now that interest rates are more material, have been recent decades, is drafting into their agreements that any interest revenue associated with some funds that are pre-advanced has to be a project. Now, that's not necessarily consistent across all agreements today, but there's conversations in recovery money in terms of that being a requirement of the province. So we're still progressing those conversations where the agreement is silent, how we plan to proceed. Where there is an agreement clause that money must be attributable to that project, we are going to honor that. And in some cases, I am doing separate GICs specific for funds attributable to a project so that that interest revenue that is earned directly attributable funding costs related to that project. And so there is some gray area in that space that we're currently navigating, but we are seeing more agreements have clauses which interest revenue on any funds must be attributable to projects in scope of the actual project it was funding.
Would that be a hard assets or soft assets? Do we know? In other words, hard assets, we can use it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, water meters and the water fund are pretty close to being the same thing. It's water, right? So would we be able to put some of that in our water reserves? Because it's water, you know. Well,
It has to go directly towards the project that was proposed for that fund.
water is in that. No water,
we'll,
no community.
We'll,
right?
we'll take any option we can to be as flexible as we can, but we'll have to obviously follow the contract, right? So whatever the provincial government decides, we don't have a lot of options on.
Okay, no, just asking. I was curious. Thank you.
$250,000 grant through TODA. Did anybody apply for that?
Well, we don't use TODA.
You can though. Anybody can apply for
I
it.
know, but we've used TODA in the past and it hasn't, we've sent them packing.
Well, I've
more
used
than
them and
once.
they're 100%.
We've used them. and
It doesn't
not
hurt to
had-
try. It's $250,000.
We have our here last week and went through grants with all of the directors, including the CFO and myself. So we have identified numerous grants that we'll be applying on for specific projects. One of the things we're really working on is not chasing money. So, you know, what happens is sometimes municipalities or individuals or companies will see a grant and they'll chase it, and then we have it, but we don't have the capacity to use it, right? So we're, as we go through our prioritization around projects, what grants fit to those higher priority projects? Because what happens is we end up in a position where we have to give money back, which I hate, but you know, federal and provincial grants have a lifespan, and we don't want to overburden the staff by doing too many things. We want to make sure the right things are done in a timely fashion and then go after grants. So grants that we've identified specifically that we're going to be able to use in the next 3 to 4 years are the ones we're focusing on for specific projects. So our grant writer does a lot of research on what's out there and how they even peripherally fit with our projects.
So just to clarify on the hard and soft assets, a soft asset is when you get a grant and it's used specifically for that grant. A hard asset is you can use it for anything you want. And that usually comes in Mad-March, right? That's how we're doing the Vote Street upgrade with the 2.7 million we were given, because that was a hard asset. We could do anything we wanted with it. Soft asset means it's going to be for that project alone. So, and with the water meters, I mean, for years, new construction of houses had to have water meters in them. So we probably have a fair amount of water meters in houses already, which probably would end up being a little bit of a surplus by the time we moved into it. But I think you're right. It's a multi-year situation because there's going to be a lot of education for the people in the community that have been getting free water for as long as they have been. Well, they're not free. They still pay for it. It's just they don't realize how they pay for it. So anyway, thank you.
On Boat Street, for example, there is a requirement in that agreement to create a reserve at year end. And so anytime we're creating on statutory reserve, we'll need to allocate investment to it. And so with the requirement to create that reserve of itself creates requirements for allocation. So it's just something to be aware of, and we'll have to do an inventory agreement by agreement. We're looking at that now, given that interest rates have become more material. We are progressing that, but that one in particular, I'll need to create a reserve at year end. That ultimately is the investment return allocation. So for the final section, starting on page 49, before you get into conversations with each director, I wanted to make sure council had an overall consolidated view of both the capital and operating preliminary plans. For funding the capital program in particular, as mentioned earlier, fire department, corporate services, city hall capital, etc., have the ability to fund with some combination of grants, borrowing, reserves, etc. Really going to be in public workspace and to some extent recreation as well. That will to track of the conversation, understand priorities, and potentially make some adjustments accordingly. So as you're looking at that capital profile, this is as it stands today. And ultimately, as we identify those priorities, there may be some shifts in timing. So that could be something out, and it may also involve trimming some projects as well. So this is where we stand today on a preliminary basis, and overall we'll keep track as we're going through some of the director by director tables where council's at in terms of projects. On the operating side graph on page 50, you'll notice that I've tried to essentially create a bridge in terms of the view, and it connects 2023 budget with the 2024 budget. And you'll see that I've done this throughout each of the directors' operating sections, so council has a chance to understand what drives the year-over-year changes. You will have seen some of these numbers in previous graphs in terms of that stack of 2024 costs. But for example, 2023 budget, 20.4 million, going to 23.3 million on a preliminary basis next year. What drives that? So we have cost pressures in terms of requests from directors that'll be in front of you for consideration out of the levy. We've got debt impacts, and the majority of that is exit 6, but it also includes payments for like the wildland fire truck that we did this year. Now we're incurring those principal and interest obligations on. You've already heard tonight about some of those inflationary pressures in terms of 400,000 just from the RCMP transit, which are for us to control. Really, that only leaves about 200,000 in inflation from actual operations. You'll have a session with the CAO on wages, and so this number represents both exempt and union, fully loaded number, so it's benefits, it's wages, it's have that conversation at some point this week based on timing, where we land tonight and council's appetite going. Put that in at some point. If not, we have the placeholder on Thursday. I've also separated out any requests that I already have lined up to be sourced from grant funding, so that you know that that's not drawing on tax increase, tax levy, and probably year 2 in terms of requests. And then I've captured any operational scope changes. So by that, you'll see in different areas what that means. I'll give you a public works example. Have a base amount for things like line painting, but then there's going to be every so many years where we go and do all of city facilities. So we'll do City Hall and the arena and the aquatic center, the public works garden, anything like that over and above what we do throughout the rest of the city. And so that's what I mean by operational scope. It's something that deliberately planned in terms of the operational plan that will fluctuate a little bit from year to year. So overall next year, $200,000 reduction in scope. Scope could also be things that are grant funded. So if we had a really large amount of projects that were funded by grants in one year, you might see costs drop in the following year, and then that's operational scope. Had money to fund a project, that money's been gone, the project was executed and completed, that cost now comes out of your budget. You'll see scope in everyone's waterfall as well to capture those kind of fluctuations from year to year, separate from all the pressures that we have in terms of inflation, wages, etc. Questions? It's kind of the end of my overview. Each night as we're going through directors, I have a section to walk through with each of you, and then over where you'll have a conversation with the director in terms of capital priorities, where things like operational savings might be sourced if we decided to some of those changes or something that needed to be explored, etc.
Thank you, Kevin. I wish we'd have seen this 10 years ago. You know, it's a pill, no two ways about it, but it's I'm finally glad to see the stuff start coming out, rather than trying to Band-Aid a budget, so.
And I think Mr. Mayor would probably have time to go through some camera session tonight. It is just only 7:15, 9 to 9 o'clock. So up for that, we could start talking about some of this in camera stuff and how it impacts your budget.
Sure. Okay, so that means we go to closed session. Recommendation that this meeting be closed to the public pursuant to sections 91C, labor relations and other employee relations of the community charter. Councilor Egan, Councilor Ogan, those in favor, opposed. Closed session in a couple minutes. Oh,
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't know if we wanted to stop at this point and just let the public know that we will be continuing then this meeting. It'll be recessed after the closed session.
Mhm.
It'll be recessed and then it will be resumed again tomorrow at 5 p.m. From 5 till 6. And then at 6 o'clock, it is intended that there will be a regular council meeting, following which we will be resuming this committee of the whole meeting again.
okay. Thank you. I don't think I need to do that now because you've eloquently done that, so thank you.